After years of homelessness, Lena believed she had been forgotten by the world. Then, without warning, a lawyer handed her the keys to an old inn left behind by a woman she had never met. She thought she had inherited a place to live. Instead, she was about to inherit a purpose. Hidden within the walls of that quiet old inn was a truth that would reveal why she had been chosen and how one simple act of kindness years earlier had changed more lives than she could ever imagine. What she discovered inside would transform not only her future, but the lives of everyone who walked through those doors. Before we begin, if you enjoy heartwarming stories filled with inspiring life lessons, please like this video and subscribe for more. Now, let's discover why a forgotten young woman wasn't chosen to inherit an old inn. She was chosen to carry on a legacy. On the coldest morning of that winter, a lawyer walked past dozens of people waiting outside a soup kitchen in downtown Chicago. He wasn't looking for the richest woman in the city. He was looking for a young woman who had absolutely nothing. "Are you Lena Brooks?" The 23-year-old looked up, surprised. People rarely searched for someone living on the streets unless something had gone terribly wrong. "I've been trying to find you for 6 months," the attorney said. Lena gave a faint smile. "I think you have the wrong person." The man gently shook his head. From his leather briefcase, he removed an old brass lantern and a sealed envelope. "Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore asked me to give you these together." Lena frowned. "I don't know anyone by that name." "I know," he replied softly. "She expected you to say that." Inside the envelope was a single sentence. "You are the sole heir to Lantern House." Lena read it twice before whispering, "I've never heard of Lantern House." The attorney rested his hand on the lantern. "Before Mrs. Whitmore passed away, she gave me one final instruction. When the girl finally comes home, tell her to light this lantern before she opens the front door." Lena stared at him in confusion. "What home?" The old man smiled sadly. "I believe that's what you're about to discover." Until that morning, Lena believed loneliness was the heaviest burden a person could carry. She was wrong. The heaviest burden is believing you no longer belong anywhere. There was a time when Lena did belong somewhere. She grew up in a modest house on Chicago's South Side. Her mother filled the kitchen with laughter. Her father was a mechanic who could fix almost anything, and neighborhood children loved watching him work. Then cancer took her mother. Her father's grief slowly became anger. His anger became alcohol. And one rainy night, after words neither of them truly meant, he pointed to the door. "Just leave." She waited for him to stop her. He never did. She walked away carrying one backpack, an old photograph of her mother, and the hope that he would come looking for her. He never did. Or at least, that's what she had believed for years. Life on the streets was cold, but it never made Lena cruel. Only a few weeks before meeting the attorney, she noticed an elderly woman shivering outside Union Station. Without hesitation, Lena removed the only wool scarf she owned and wrapped it around the stranger's shoulders. The woman tried to give it back. "You need this more than I do." Lena simply smiled. "Maybe, but tonight, you need it first." Then she quietly walked away. She never asked the woman's name. She never expected anything in return. Standing there now, with an old lantern in one hand and a letter in the other, Lena had no idea that one small act of kindness was about to change the course of her life. She thought she had inherited an old inn. She had no way of knowing she was about to inherit someone else's unfinished promise, and discover that even the smallest act of compassion can echo across generations. 3 days later, Lena stepped off a small bus into a quiet Vermont town that seemed untouched by time. The driver nodded toward a hill overlooking the main street. "Lantern House is up there." Lena thanked him, adjusted the worn backpack on her shoulder, and began the slow walk uphill. The town wasn't impressive in the way cities tried to be. There were no bright billboards or crowded intersections, just weathered brick buildings, old maple trees lining the sidewalks, and neighbors who still paused to wave at one another. At the very top of the hill stood a large Victorian inn. Its white paint had faded after decades of harsh winters. One shutter hung slightly crooked, and the porch creaked beneath every gust of wind. A few windows needed replacing, and vines had begun climbing the stone chimney. Yet somehow, it didn't feel abandoned. It felt as if it had simply been waiting. The attorney unlocked the front door but remained outside. "Aren't you coming in?" Lena asked. He smiled and slowly shook his head. "No, this house belongs to you now." Then he placed a heavy ring of brass keys into her hand. "Mrs. Whitmore asked me to tell you only 2 things." Lena waited. "First, light the lantern. And second, don't decide too quickly what this place is worth." Before Lena could ask another question, the attorney tipped his hat, returned to his car, and drove away, leaving her standing alone in front of the old inn. For a moment, she looked down at the brass lantern. It felt almost foolish. Still, she struck a match. The small flame flickered gently behind the dusty glass. Nothing happened. No hidden passage opened. No mysterious voice echoed through the house. Lena smiled to herself. "Just an old tradition," she whispered. She pushed open the heavy wooden door. Warm afternoon sunlight spilled through dusty windows, filling the entrance hall with floating specks of light. Old furniture remained exactly where it had always been. Shelves overflowed with books. A grandfather clock continued ticking steadily in the hallway, as though it had never accepted that its owner was gone. Someone had cared deeply for this place. Near the entrance sat a small handwritten card. "Welcome home, Lena." She froze. Her name, written in delicate handwriting. How could Eleanor have known she would eventually arrive? The attorney had said they spent months searching for her. Yet somehow, the woman who had never met her seemed to have expected this day all along. An uneasy feeling settled inside her. Not fear, not curiosity. Something stranger. As if she had arrived somewhere she was always meant to find. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly as Lena explored the inn. Every room seemed to tell its own story. One bedroom was covered with handmade quilts stitched from faded pieces of fabric. Another contained shelves filled with children's books and worn teddy bears. One upstairs room overlooked the mountains, where an old rocking chair still faced the window, waiting for someone who would never return. There was nothing luxurious about Lantern House. The roof needed repairs. The plumbing was old. The walls needed paint. Restoring the building would cost more money than Lena had ever imagined owning. Selling it suddenly seemed like the only sensible option. As evening approached, she began sorting through paperwork inside Eleanor's office. While pulling open the bottom drawer of an old desk, her fingers brushed against something unusual. Taped beneath the drawer was a small iron key tied with a faded blue ribbon. There was no label, no explanation. Curiosity got the better of her. She searched the first floor until she noticed a narrow wooden door, almost completely hidden behind a tall bookshelf in the library. The key slid smoothly into the lock. With a soft click, the door opened. The room beyond stole her breath. Instead of jewelry, antiques, or stacks of money, floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with hundreds of handcrafted wooden boxes. Every box carried a handwritten name. Some also included dates. Others simply read, "Unknown." Lena carefully lifted the nearest box from the shelf. Inside lay an old photograph of a young soldier, a wedding ring, and a neatly folded letter. She unfolded it with trembling hands. "If anyone ever reads this, please know my husband survived the war, but the war never truly left him. Mrs. Whitmore was the only person willing to sit beside him without asking him to explain his silence. She saved our marriage simply by listening." Lena quietly returned the letter to its box. Then she opened another. Inside were a tiny pair of baby shoes, a faded hospital bracelet, and another handwritten note. "You gave me a room the night I believed life was over. Today, my daughter turns 30. Another box. Another life. Another story." Some ended with joy. Others ended with heartbreak. Yet every one of them carried the same message. Someone had arrived at Lantern House believing they had been forgotten. Someone had left believing they still mattered. Time slipped away unnoticed. Outside, darkness settled over the hills, while the lantern beside the front door continued glowing softly. Finally, Lena noticed a single wooden box resting alone on the highest shelf. Unlike the others, it carried no name. Only 3 simple words. "For my successor." Her heartbeat quickened. Inside rested a thick leather-bound journal. She opened the first page. Written in elegant handwriting were the words, "The Mercy Ledger." Beneath the title, Eleanor had written one final message. "Every person who enters this house carries a story the world almost forgot. Promise me you'll remember." Lena slowly closed the journal. When she had arrived that afternoon, she believed she had inherited an aging inn that needed expensive repairs. Now, for the first time, she realized Eleanor Whitmore had never intended to leave her a building. She had left her something far heavier, the responsibility of carrying hundreds of forgotten stories. And standing alone in that silent room, surrounded by the lives of strangers who had once believed they didn't matter, Lena wasn't sure she was strong enough to become the next keeper of Lantern House. Lena barely slept that night. Long after midnight, she remained in Eleanor Whitmore's hidden room, surrounded by hundreds of wooden boxes belonging to people she would never meet. Each one held an ordinary life. A faded photograph, a handwritten recipe, a child's drawing, a military medal, a train ticket. Things the rest of the world might have thrown away without a second thought. Yet somehow, Eleanor had known they mattered. Lena couldn't stop wondering why. Why would anyone spend an entire lifetime preserving the memories of strangers? And why leave that responsibility to a homeless young woman she had never even met? As dawn broke over the mountains, she carried the Mercy Ledger into the kitchen, made herself a cup of coffee, and began reading from the very first page. The journal wasn't organized like a business record. It was a collection of stories. Every guest who had ever stayed at Lantern House had a page. Some stayed only one night. Others remained for months. Eleanor never wrote about what they owned. She wrote about what they had lost. A widow who had forgotten how to laugh after 53 years of marriage. A teenage boy who had run away because he believed his family would be better off without him. A retired schoolteacher who spent every Christmas alone after outliving everyone she loved. Again and again, the stories ended the same way. They arrived believing they no longer mattered. They left believing they did. Hours passed before Lena noticed something unusual. Certain pages carried a small lantern drawn in the corner. Others did not. She flipped through dozens of entries until she found Eleanor's explanation. Some people need a bed. Others need food. But a few only need one person willing to remember their name. Lena quietly closed the journal. For years, she had believed surviving meant finding food, staying warm, and making it through another night. Eleanor seemed to believe survival began somewhere much deeper. Near noon, someone knocked on the front door. Standing outside was an elderly woman carrying a basket of homemade bread. "My name is Martha. I used to help Eleanor around the inn." Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside, looked around the empty lobby, and smiled. "It still smells like her." Lena offered coffee, and the two women sat together in the dining room. For nearly an hour, Martha shared stories about Eleanor, how she remembered every birthday, how she never let anyone spend Thanksgiving alone, how she somehow knew exactly when someone needed silence instead of advice. Finally, Lena asked the question that had been haunting her since arriving. "Why did Eleanor choose me?" Martha's warm smile slowly faded. "I don't know." Then, after a long forked pause, she added quietly, "But I know she spent the last year of her life waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For you." Lena frowned. "That doesn't make any sense. I never met her." Martha looked toward the old lantern glowing softly near the entrance. "No, but she met someone who reminded her of you." Before Lena could ask another question, Martha reached into her handbag and placed a small envelope on the table. "Eleanor asked me to give you this only after you found the Mercy Ledger." Lena recognized the handwriting immediately. With careful hands, she unfolded the letter. "Dear Lena, by the time you read this, I will be gone. If you're wondering why I chose you, the answer isn't because you were homeless. It isn't because I felt sorry for you. It's because someone once told me about a young woman in Chicago who shared her last scarf with an elderly stranger during the coldest week of winter. She walked away before anyone could thank her. A person who expects nothing in return for kindness understands this house better than most people ever will." Lena stopped reading. The scarf. The woman outside Union Station. Her heart began pounding. She looked up at Martha. "The woman." Martha nodded. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore. The room fell completely silent. Lena had spent days believing she had inherited the house of a stranger. Now she realized she had already met its owner. She simply hadn't known who she was. Tears blurred the words on the page as she continued reading. "That night you reminded me of the woman I once hoped I had been. Compassion cannot be taught. It reveals itself when no one is watching. That is why Lantern House belongs to you." Lena lowered the letter into her lap. She remembered that freezing evening with perfect clarity. She had never asked the elderly woman's name, never expected to see her again. She certainly had never imagined that one simple act of kindness would change her entire future. Martha quietly reached across the table and squeezed Lena's hand. Eleanor said something before she passed. "What did she say?" The old woman smiled through tears. She said, "I finally found someone who understands that love isn't measured by what we keep. It's measured by what we're willing to give away." Neither woman spoke for several minutes. Outside, the church bell rang noon across the quiet town. Lena looked toward the front entrance, where the brass lantern continued burning with its small, steady flame. For the first time in years, she understood something that had never made sense before. Every kind thing we do leaves us believing we've walked away from it. Sometimes, it has only just begun its journey. She folded Eleanor's letter carefully and slipped it inside the Mercy Ledger. Then she looked around the old inn once more. When she had first arrived, Lantern House had seemed like an unexpected inheritance. Now it felt like something entirely different. It felt like an invitation to continue a promise that had begun long before she was born. And although Lena still had no idea how she would save the aging inn, She knew one thing with absolute certainty. For the first time since leaving home years earlier, she no longer felt like a person who had nowhere to belong. For the next several days, Lena stopped thinking about selling Lantern House. Not because she had suddenly fallen in love with the old building, but because every time she picked up the Mercy Ledger, she discovered another life that refused to be forgotten. Every morning she lit Eleanor's brass lantern before the sun came up. At first, it simply felt like honoring an old woman's final request. Soon, it became something more. A quiet reminder that every new day offered another chance to see someone the rest of the world overlooked. She spent hours cleaning the inn. Dust disappeared from bookshelves. Windows that hadn't been washed in years began letting sunlight pour into the hallways again. She repaired loose chairs, polished old photographs, and carefully returned every wooden memory box to its proper place. The work was exhausting, but for the first time in years, she wasn't cleaning because someone had told her to. She was caring for something that somehow already felt like family. One afternoon, while sorting through Eleanor's office, Lena found an old guest register. The earliest entries dated back almost 40 years. Some names appeared only once. Others returned again and again over decades. She began noticing something unusual. Next to certain names, Eleanor had written tiny notes in the margins. Lost his wife. Finally laughed today. Still blames himself. Needs someone to listen. There were no judgments. No criticism. Only quiet observations made by someone who had learned that pain often hides behind ordinary smiles. Lena ran her fingers across the faded ink. She realized Eleanor had never tried to rescue people. She had simply refused to let them carry their burdens alone. That evening there was another knock at the front door. A gray-haired man stood outside holding a small wooden toolbox. "My name's Walter," he said. "I heard somebody finally came back." Without waiting for permission, he walked onto the porch and looked at the sagging railing. Eleanor would have been embarrassed if she knew I let this get so bad. Before Lena could answer, he opened the toolbox and got to work. The next morning, another neighbor arrived. Then another. One brought fresh vegetables from her garden. Someone else repaired a leaking faucet. A retired electrician replaced broken light fixtures. By the end of the week, Lantern House was filled with the sounds of hammers, laughter, and conversations drifting through open windows. Nobody asked for payment. Nobody even discussed it. Helping Lantern House simply seemed like the natural thing to do. Watching them work, Lena finally understood something she had missed. People weren't showing up because of the building. They were showing up because years earlier, Eleanor had shown up for them. Kindness had been quietly collecting interest for decades. Now, without anyone planning it, that kindness was coming home. One afternoon, Walter found Lena sitting alone on the front porch. "You've been reading her journals." Lena nodded. "They're incredible." Walter smiled. "You know what Eleanor used to tell me." Lena looked over. "She'd say that loneliness isn't the absence of people. It's the absence of feeling remembered." Those words settled deep inside Lena. For years, she had believed she was homeless because she had no roof. Now she realized the truth was much harder. She had felt homeless long before she ever slept on the streets. She had felt homeless the day she believed no one would ever come looking for her again. That evening, she climbed into the attic to continue organizing old belongings. Hidden inside a cedar chest, she discovered several unopened boxes labeled only with years. Most contained Christmas decorations, old blankets, family photographs. Then she found a small envelope tucked inside an antique Bible. Across the front, Eleanor had written, "To be opened only when you begin to understand." Lena slowly unfolded the letter. "If you're reading this, then you've already discovered the secret of Lantern House. It was never built to rescue broken people. People are not projects to be repaired. This house exists for one simple reason. Everyone deserves one place in the world where they don't have to pretend they're okay. Lena read the sentence again and again. She thought about the people Eleanor had written about. The veteran who never spoke about the war. The widow who had forgotten how to smile. The frightened young mother. The lonely teacher. None of them had needed someone to solve their lives. Most had simply needed one place where they were accepted exactly as they were. Suddenly, Lena understood why Eleanor had chosen an inn instead of a charity. An inn asks no questions before offering someone a room. It simply opens its door. As the sun began setting behind the mountains, Lena carried the brass lantern onto the front porch. She lit it just as Eleanor had done for so many years. Its warm glow spread across the fading evening light. A little girl walking past with her grandfather stopped to look. "Grandpa," she whispered. "The lantern's back." The old man smiled. "I was wondering when I'd see it again." They continued walking, but not before waving toward the porch. Lena waved back. It was only a small moment, almost forgettable. Yet somehow it filled the old house with life again. Later that night, Lena opened the Mercy Ledger and wrote her very first entry. Not about herself. About Walter repairing the porch without being asked. About Martha bringing homemade bread. About neighbors who remembered kindness long after Eleanor was gone. When she finished writing, she closed the journal and rested her hand on its worn leather cover. For years, she had believed that home was a place you were born. Then she believed it was a place you lost. Now she understood something Eleanor had known all along. Home is not the place that keeps you from being lonely. Home is the place that reminds you. You were never meant to carry life alone. Outside, the lantern continued burning quietly in the darkness. And for the first time since Eleanor's passing, Lantern House no longer looked like a building waiting to die. It looked like a promise beginning again. Spring arrived quietly in the hills of Vermont. Snow melted from the rooftops. Wildflowers pushed through the frozen ground. And for the first time in years, laughter could be heard drifting through the halls of Lantern House. The porch had been repaired. Fresh paint covered the faded front door. The old dining room smelled of coffee and homemade pies instead of dust. Neighbors stopped by almost every day, not because they had to, but because Lantern House had always felt like a place where everyone belonged. Lena found herself smiling more often than she realized. She had begun remembering names the way Eleanor once had. She knew which neighbor preferred tea over coffee. Which widower always arrived carrying flowers for his late wife? Which little boy insisted on reading the same adventure book every Saturday afternoon? Slowly, almost without noticing, Lena had become the keeper of a place that seemed to heal people in ways no one could explain. Then, one Monday morning, everything changed. A black luxury SUV rolled slowly up the gravel driveway. It looked strangely out of place against the quiet countryside. A sharply dressed man stepped out, followed by two assistants carrying leather folders. He introduced himself with a practiced smile. "My name is Richard Calloway. I represent Evergreen Development." Lena invited him inside. He spent only a few minutes walking through the building before stopping in the front lobby. "You've done remarkable work. But this property is beyond saving." His voice was polite, professional, almost sympathetic. He opened one of the folders and spread several architectural drawings across the table. "Our company plans to build a luxury wellness resort overlooking the valley." He pointed toward the large windows. "The location is perfect." Lena quietly studied the drawings. Elegant hotel rooms, a spa, restaurants, private cottages. Everything looked beautiful. Then Richard slid another document toward her. "We'd like to purchase Lantern House." Lena didn't answer immediately. He named the amount. It was more money than she had ever imagined seeing in her lifetime. Enough to buy a comfortable home. Enough to start over anywhere she wanted. Enough to make sure she would never experience homelessness again. Richard leaned back in his chair. "You've worked hard. You deserve a better life than maintaining a building that's falling apart." He wasn't cruel. He wasn't trying to manipulate her. If anything, he sounded sincere. For the rest of the afternoon, Lena couldn't stop thinking about the offer. That evening, she walked slowly through every room of Lantern House. She noticed the cracks in the ceiling, the aging pipes, the draft slipping through old windows. Richard wasn't wrong. The repairs would cost far more than she could afford. How long could she realistically keep the inn alive? A few months? A year? Eventually, reality would catch up with hope. Later that night, she opened the Mercy Ledger, hoping it might somehow help her think more clearly. Instead, a folded envelope slipped from between the pages. She had never seen it before. Across the front, Eleanor had written only 4 words. "When the easy answer comes." Lena unfolded the letter. "Dear Lena, if you are reading this, someone has probably offered to buy Lantern House. Don't judge them too harshly. Most people see land. They see buildings. They see numbers. They cannot see memories. They cannot calculate hope, and they certainly cannot measure the value of a place where someone once decided to keep living." Lena stopped reading. Outside, the evening wind gently rattled the porch swing. She continued, "There may come a day when selling this house feels like the sensible thing to do. If that day arrives, don't ask yourself how much the building is worth. Ask yourself what disappears if these doors are closed forever." Lena quietly lowered the letter. The question echoed through her mind. What disappears? The answer came more quickly than she expected. Walter's laughter while repairing the porch. Martha's fresh bread every Tuesday morning. The little girl who smiled every evening when the lantern was lit. The stories inside hundreds of wooden boxes. The people who still believed Eleanor was somehow watching over them. None of those things would appear on a financial statement. None of them increased the property's market value. Yet somehow, they were the most valuable things Lantern House possessed. The following afternoon, Richard returned. "I hope you've had time to think." Lena nodded. "I have." He smiled confidently. "I can increase the offer." She gently shook her head. "It isn't about the money." Richard looked genuinely puzzled. "Then what is it about?" Lena stood and slowly walked toward the front porch. The brass lantern was already waiting on its hook. Every evening before sunset, she lit it. It had become a promise. She struck a match. The small flame flickered to life. Then she turned back toward Richard. "When I first came here," she said softly, "I believed this was an old inn. Now I know it's something else." Richard remained silent. "It's where people come when they've forgotten they matter." He glanced around the quiet house. "I understand how sentimental that sounds." Lena smiled. "So do I. But not everything valuable can be sold." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard closed his folder. "I've negotiated hundreds of property purchases." He gave a small, respectful smile. "I've never lost to a lantern before." Lena laughed quietly. "You didn't lose. You simply found something that isn't for sale." Richard extended his hand. "I hope you keep it alive." "I hope so too," Lena replied. As the SUV disappeared down the hill, Lena remained on the porch watching the evening light settle across the valley. For the first time since inheriting Lantern House, she understood that Eleanor had never been testing her ability to manage an inn. She had been testing something much deeper. Whether Lena believed security came from owning money, or from protecting the place that had taught countless strangers they still belonged. That night she opened the Mercy Ledger once again. Beneath Eleanor's final entry, she wrote her own. "Today, I was offered everything I once believed I wanted. I said no, because somewhere along the way, this house stopped being my inheritance. It became my purpose." She gently closed the journal. Outside, the lantern continued shining into the darkness, just as it had for decades. And somewhere beyond its warm circle of light, another weary traveler was beginning a journey they didn't yet know would lead them home. Summer arrived, and for the first time in years, every room at Lantern House was occupied, not by tourists, but by people who simply needed somewhere to breathe. A retired firefighter recovering from the loss of his wife stayed in the room overlooking the mountains. A young mother escaping an abusive marriage found peace in the little bedroom beneath the attic. An elderly veteran who had spent months sleeping in his truck finally accepted a warm bed after insisting for 3 days that someone else needed it more. Every evening, just before sunset, Lena lit the brass lantern. Without anyone announcing it, the ritual had become part of the town's rhythm. Children waved as they passed the porch. Neighbors slowed their evening walks. Some people even sat quietly across the street for a few minutes, watching the gentle glow spread across the old front steps. It reminded everyone that no matter how difficult life became, someone would always leave a light on. One Friday afternoon, while Lena was serving coffee in the dining room, Martha hurried through the front door. She looked unusually anxious. "Lena, you have a visitor. I've never seen him before." Lena wiped her hands on a towel and walked toward the entrance. A silver pickup truck sat in the driveway. Leaning against it was an elderly man, perhaps in his late 70s. His clothes were clean but worn. His shoulders were slightly bent. In one hand he held a faded brown suitcase that looked older than Lena herself. The moment he saw her, he removed his cap. For several seconds, he simply stared, as if convincing himself she was real. Finally he spoke. I don't suppose you remember me?" Lena searched his face. There was something strangely familiar about his eyes, but she couldn't place him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I don't." The old man nodded, almost as if he had expected that answer. "I figured you wouldn't." He looked down at the suitcase. "My name is Thomas. I used to know your father." The words hit Lena like a sudden gust of cold wind. She hadn't heard anyone mention her father in years. "You knew him?" Thomas nodded. "We worked together. He talked about you every single day." Lena felt her heartbeat quicken. "That's impossible. He told me to leave. He never came looking." Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he carefully lifted the old suitcase onto the porch. "I think there's something you should see." Inside the suitcase were dozens of neatly bundled envelopes. Every one of them had the same name written across the front. Lena Brooks. None had ever been opened. Her hands began to tremble. "There must be 50 of them." "There are 68, Thomas replied quietly. "One for every month he couldn't find you." Lena couldn't breathe. She picked up the first envelope. The postmark was nearly 4 years old. The stamp had never been canceled. The letter had never been mailed. "Why?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "Why didn't he send them?" Thomas lowered himself into one of the rocking chairs on the porch. "Because he never knew where to send them." Silence settled between them. The breeze stirred the trees surrounding Lantern House. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echoed through the valley. Thomas looked toward the lantern hanging beside the front door. After you left, your father stopped drinking. Lena looked up sharply. What? He checked himself into treatment. It took 3 attempts, but he finally stayed. She stared at him, unable to speak. He sold his garage. He used the money to hire private investigators. He visited shelters in 3 different states. He carried your photograph in his wallet. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a faded picture. It was the same photograph Lena remembered being taken on her 12th birthday. Only this copy was worn from years of being handled. He showed this picture to everyone. He kept asking, "Have you seen my daughter?" Lena's eyes filled with tears. No. He would have found me. Thomas slowly shook his head. You were changing shelters. Sometimes you slept outside. There wasn't a trail to follow. He paused, and then he got sick. The words hung heavily in the air. Cancer, the same disease that took your mother. Lena closed her eyes. It felt cruel, almost impossible. Thomas continued quietly. The last time I visited him in the hospital, he handed me this suitcase. He said, "If I don't make it..." Please don't stop looking. Lena covered her mouth. The tears came before she could stop them. For years she had built her life around one belief, that her father had chosen not to find her. Now, in a single afternoon, that belief was falling apart. Thomas gently nodded toward the suitcase. He wrote to you every month, sometimes every week. He said writing the letters made him feel like he was still talking to you. Lena reached for one of the envelopes. She hesitated. I don't know if I can... Thomas smiled sadly. You don't have to read them today. But there's one. I think you should. He reached into the very bottom of the suitcase and removed a smaller envelope. Unlike the others, it bore no stamp. Across the front, in unsteady handwriting, were the words, "To be opened only if my daughter is finally found." Lena slowly unfolded the letter. The paper shook in her hands. My dearest Lena, if you're reading this, then someone finally did what I could not. They found you. I don't know how many years have passed. I don't know whether you'll ever forgive me. The night I told you to leave has become the greatest regret of my life. I wasn't angry with you. I was angry that I couldn't save your mother. And I punished the only person I had left. A tear landed on the page. She kept reading. Every day since then, I've prayed for one more chance to tell you something. You were never unwanted. You were never unloved. You were simply the greatest blessing entrusted to a broken man who forgot how to carry his own grief. Lena couldn't continue. The words blurred through her tears. Thomas quietly stood. Before walking away, he placed one hand gently on her shoulder. There's one more thing your father wanted you to know. She looked up. The last place he ever asked us to search. Thomas glanced toward the glowing lantern hanging beside the front door. Was Lantern House. Lena stared at him in disbelief. He'd heard rumors about an elderly woman who never turned away lonely people. He told me, if my daughter is still alive, someday she'll find a place like that. Thomas climbed into his truck. As he drove slowly down the hill, Lena remained on the porch, holding the suitcase against her chest. The evening sun disappeared behind the mountains. One by one, the lights inside Lantern House began to glow. She looked toward Eleanor's brass lantern. For the first time, She realized something that sent a chill through her entire body. Perhaps Eleanor hadn't chosen her by chance. Perhaps two broken hearts, one searching for a daughter, the other searching for a home, had been moving toward Lantern House all along without ever knowing it. And suddenly, Lena understood that the story she thought was ending had only now revealed its deepest secret. Autumn arrived almost unnoticed. The maple trees surrounding Lantern House slowly turned shades of gold and crimson, covering the front lawn with leaves that crunched beneath every visitor's footsteps. Inside the old inn, life had settled into a rhythm Eleanor Whitmore would have recognized. Every morning began with coffee brewing in the kitchen. Every afternoon, someone wandered into the library to read or simply sit in silence. And every evening, just before sunset, Lena stepped onto the porch and lit the brass lantern. No one had to remind her anymore. The light had become a promise that no one would ever have to wonder if there was still a place for them. Months passed. The Mercy ledger grew heavier, not because the journal itself had changed, but because Lena had begun adding new stories. Walter repairing the porch after losing his wife, the veteran who smiled for the first time in years after sharing dinner with strangers, the young mother who found enough courage to start over. Every page reminded her of something Eleanor had understood long before anyone else. People don't heal because someone fixes their lives. They heal because someone refuses to give up on them. Then, one chilly October evening, there was another knock at the front door. Lena opened it to find a teenage girl standing alone. She couldn't have been more than 16. Her sweatshirt was soaked from the rain. Her backpack looked nearly empty. She avoided eye contact. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I saw the lantern. I wasn't sure if it meant someone was here." Lena smiled gently. "It does." The girl hesitated. "I don't have any money." "You don't need any. I don't even know how long I'll stay." "You don't have to know tonight." The girl's shoulders began to shake. For several seconds she fought to hold back her tears. Then they came anyway. Lena stepped forward and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. No questions, no judgment, only warmth. As they walked inside, Lena caught her own reflection in the hallway mirror. For just a moment, she saw herself, the frightened young woman who had once stood on this same porch believing she didn't belong anywhere. Without realizing it, she had become the person Eleanor had once been. Later that night, after the girl had fallen asleep upstairs, Lena opened the Mercy ledger. She reached for her pen, then stopped. Instead of writing another story immediately, she turned back to the very first page Eleanor had ever written. She read the familiar words once more. Every person who enters this house carries a story the world almost forgot. This time she noticed something she had somehow missed before. At the bottom of the page, written in much smaller handwriting, was one final sentence. "Someday, another pair of hands will finish this book. And when they do, I hope they never realize where my story ends. Because that will mean they have started writing their own." Lena quietly closed the journal. For the first time, she understood. The Mercy ledger had never been Eleanor's story. It had always belonged to whoever chose to continue it. The following Sunday, the entire town gathered on the front lawn of Lantern House. No one had planned a celebration. It simply happened. Walter brought folding chairs. Martha baked enough pies to feed everyone. Children ran across the grass while older neighbors shared memories of Eleanor that grew richer with every retelling. As the sun began to set, Richard Calloway, the developer who had once tried to buy the inn, walked slowly up the hill carrying a wooden crate. Lena greeted him with surprise. "I didn't expect to see you. I wasn't sure I'd come," he admitted. Then he opened the crate. Inside were dozens of brand new lanterns, small enough to carry by hand. I've been thinking about what you told me. He smiled. I build hotels, but I've never built hope. He handed one lantern to Lena. I'd like to help. One by one, the townspeople stepped forward. Each person accepted a lantern. Soon, the lawn glowed with dozens of tiny lights. Children, grandparents, veterans, widows, teachers, mechanics, farmers, people who had once believed Lantern House had saved them. People who now understood they had become part of saving it. As darkness settled over the valley, Lena climbed onto the porch steps. She looked across the crowd. Some faces she knew well. Others had only recently arrived. Yet all of them shared the same quiet expression. They had come home. Lena cleared her throat. I used to think this house changed my life because someone left it to me. She paused. But I was wrong. This house changed my life because it taught me something I should have learned a long time ago. She looked toward the brass lantern hanging beside the front door. A home isn't built from wood. It isn't built from stone. It's built every single time one human being chooses another human being instead of walking away. Silence settled over the crowd. Many wiped tears from their eyes. Even Richard quietly lowered his head. Lena smiled. My father spent years trying to find me. Eleanor spent years preparing this place. And all of you. She looked around the glowing lawn. I kept the light alive until I finally arrived. She reached up and gently touched the old brass lantern. I used to believe this lantern was meant to guide lost people here. She smiled through tears. Now I think it serves another purpose. It reminds the people already here to become the light for someone else. No one applauded. No one needed to. The moment was too honest for applause. As the evening came to an end, families slowly walked home, carrying their lanterns through the quiet streets. From the hilltop, Lantern House looked different than it ever had before. Not because the building had changed, but because tiny lights could now be seen throughout the town. One in a farmhouse window, another on a front porch, another beside a church, another outside a small apartment. The light Eleanor had protected for decades no longer belonged to one house. It had become part of an entire community. Standing alone on the porch, Lena looked toward the stars. She whispered words she wished both Eleanor and her father could somehow hear. I understand now. Thank you for bringing me home. The old brass lantern burned steadily beside her, just as it always had, just as she hoped it always would, and somewhere beyond the reach of its warm golden light, another lonely soul was already beginning the journey that would one day lead them to the same front door. Years passed. Lantern House never became famous. It never appeared in travel magazines or won awards. But every evening, just before sunset, the old brass lantern was still lit. The Mercy Ledger had grown from one worn journal into several thick volumes, each filled with stories of people who had arrived carrying invisible burdens and left believing they still mattered. One chilly autumn evening, another stranger climbed the front steps. An elderly man stood quietly beneath the lantern, holding nothing but a small suitcase. He hesitated, as though he had forgotten what it felt like to be welcomed. Before he could knock, the front door opened. Lena smiled, the same gentle smile Eleanor had once given her. Come inside, she said softly. You're home. As the man stepped across the threshold, Lena glanced at Eleanor's photograph hanging in the hallway. For a brief moment, she realized something that brought tears to her eyes. Lantern House had never truly belonged to Eleanor. It had never truly belonged to her. It belonged to every person who chose kindness when the world offered indifference. That was the real inheritance. Not the house, not the land, but the courage to leave a light on for someone else. Perhaps that's the greatest legacy any of us can leave behind. Years from now, people may forget what we owned or how successful we were, but they will never forget how we made them feel. A single act of compassion, a second chance, a door left open, a light waiting in the darkness. Sometimes, that's enough to change the course of another person's life. And maybe, without ever knowing it, we become the answer to someone else's prayer. As night settled over the valley, the little brass lantern continued to glow. Its light wasn't powerful enough to brighten the entire world. It only needed to shine far enough for one lost soul to find the way home. Perhaps that's all any of us are called to do. Leave the light on, because somewhere, someone is still searching.